give Nick an epic round of applause. Maybe again.
Everybody. As Ken said, what I'm going to be doing today is talking about my new book, which is called Keep Out, which is a study of secret places around the world with links to UFOs. That's to say, official locations, government and military installations. And Ken's right, there actually is a tie-in with all this, with the 2012 controversy, which I'll get into. A lot of people have asked me, you know, how can you kind of condense a book down on secret installations around the world when there's a never-ending list of secret installations? The book, some people have incorrectly assumed it's like a study just of secret military bases. It isn't. It's a study of sort of off-limits installations that all specifically have a UFO link to them. So if there's no sort of UFO or sort of slightly paranormal thing, it doesn't feature in the book. In other words, it's not like a military history study of, you know, the CIA headquarters and the different levels or anything like that. But it does tie in if, say, for example, as some people have alleged, you know, that alien bodies, etc., stored in some deep vault below the CIA. So it's sort of like a careful distinction between the two. But it's sort of an important one, is to just sort of, as you know, what the book covers and what it actually doesn't cover as well. And what I've done with the research, really, because a lot of these places, the very fact that they are off limits means, to an extent at least, we don't know the full story of what goes on there or what doesn't. So what I've done, again, is to sort of present the official story of what's taking place at these installations versus what people in the UFO conspiracy field believe is going on, and as to how they've come to these conclusions, and then allow the reader to make up their own opinion as to what, if they feel the information's valid. Because I think when we're dealing with sort of definitive unknowns, where we're not really sure what's going on, it would be sort of wrong, basically, for me to say, I can say for sure this is what's going on. And if I say, well, I believe this is going on, that means nothing. You know, we need evidence. So that's why I sort of present both sides of the argument, to see really sort of where the land lies and where the truth begins and where the rumour starts, etc., etc. And okay, that isn't sort of like a pile of ice cream or something that's sort of fallen on the floor. It's actually an aerial photograph of Area 51. I guess if you're dealing with secret installations and off-limit bases and things like that, then Area 51 is the one that everybody knows about and everybody thinks about. And the main reason being that Area 51, you know, it isn't just something that is known about within the UFO research community, but certainly in the last 10 years or so, it's really entered sort of popular culture, pop culture, TV, movies, etc., etc. It featured in shows like The X-Files and even in Independence Day. And what's interesting is that when Independence Day was being made, the US military was very happy to get involved, because it presented the military in a good light, you know, sort of standing up against this hostile invader. And the producers and directors said, well, we want to include Area 51 in the story, and suddenly it was like, no, and the military drew its involvement at that point. They just, we're not, you know, we'll allow shots of aircraft, you can do filming at air bases and that sort of thing, military installations, but when it comes to Area 51, we're not going to offer any help at all, even in a fictional format. So that was kind of interesting. Now, there's a lot of mythologies about Area 51, about where it is, what goes on there. A lot of people assume it's sort of like this remote fortress in the middle of nowhere in the Nevada desert. It actually isn't. It's only 90 miles from downtown Las Vegas, which is no distance at all. You know, if you put your foot down on the accelerator, you can be there, in theory, in an hour, or just a little bit more. And I know, because I've tried it. But you can only get, the problem is, why Area 51 is so secret is not its distance and it's remote location. It's just not remote at all. It's just the fact that when you start getting within about 20 miles or so of the base, which is out in the desert, it is a desert location. When you get within about 15, 20 miles, you start to see signs saying, you know, you're entering territory and land that falls under the jurisdiction of the government, and the various different signs, Department of Energy and the Air Force and things like this. And if you get too close, you know, you can be turned away by security personnel, you can be detained and arrested and charged with a criminal offence if you get too close to the base. That doesn't happen very often, because even the security personnel realise that for the most part, ironically, although it's probably the most secretive base in the world, one of the things that's different about Area 51 to, say, you know, the Pentagon, when we had the Pentagon attacks in, you know, in 9/11 and things like that, the military, I guess, is trained to know that terrorists and enemy agents, etc., and hostile personnel from other countries are going to go for military bases. But they realise, for the most part, the people who are coming around looking at Area 51 are UFO people. And so, in other words, they understand that for the most part, you know, it's, although they view us as sort of a pain in the neck for, you know, turning up at the base and wanting to know what's going on, they realise for the most part we're not using our UFO research as like a cover for some more dark and disturbing scenario, although that actually is something that the government has looked at on a number of occasions, and a number of files have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act showing when, particularly in the 1980s, when certain aspects of stealth technology was being tested and developed at Area 51, the government was actually quite concerned that a number of UFO researchers in California had actually sort of been recruited by the Soviets, the Soviet Union at the time. And in other words, they were going out to the base with high-powered cameras, and if they were stopped by the security personnel, they would say, oh, you know, I'm just looking for UFOs, and the guys would say, well, you know, just go home. But they got to hear rumours that some of these people have been turned, if you like, by the Soviets, and were using it as a cover to try and capture photographs of classified aircraft being tested there. Now, this was never actually proved, but it was a theory that was looked at for a while, and I think it's one of the main reasons why the secrecy and security was sort of upgraded at Area 51. Now, in terms of what we know about it officially, Area 51 is actually part of this huge test range which falls under the jurisdiction of the Air Force, which literally extends to more than 3,000 square miles. And so, in other words, it's a huge area. It's called Area 51 because there's actually a number of so-called test areas on the Nevada test range. Area 51's just one of them, but it happens to be the most famous one. And back in the 50s, it was where a lot of the early sort of spy plane technology was test flown and developed, like the U-2 spy plane and then the SR-71 Blackbird. And as I said, in the late 70s and through the 80s, some of the early stealth technology, which obviously culminated in the stealth bomber and the stealth fighter, which was unveiled officially, at least, in the latter part of the 1980s, early 1990s. So that's what we can say for sure about Area 51. That's the official story. Now, the unofficial story is the one that's really brought it to the public's and the media's attention, the idea that the classified aircraft aren't the only sort of thing being flown from Area 51 or stored at Area 51. The more sensational angle is the idea that there are crashed UFOs also held at Area 51. Now, I guess the beliefs in terms of the people in the research field who address this particular issue kind of fall into three categories. There are those who just disregard it and say it's nonsense. There are those who think UFOs are literally stored there, alien spacecraft, and those people who think that there are things being flown out of Area 51 that are really weird and that look, for all intents and purposes, like UFOs, and that maybe the military is quite happy for people to think they are, because stories of little green men, etc., help protect any sort of classified military programs that might be being developed there. And other people think it's a combination of all three, that there's a truth and, you know, a disinformation side, and that some people have made things up, but other people are literally telling the truth about what they've seen at Area 51. So in other words, you know, we're left, ironically, with more questions than answers. But the way in which Area 51 really became ingrained in the public's mind, if you like, when it comes to UFOs. This all goes back to 1989 and a man named Bob Lazar. And Bob Lazar, who some of you may have heard of, a sort of maverick scientist, physicist, who in early 1989 went public on one particular TV channel in Nevada and said that he'd spent a number of months working out at Area 51 to basically, as he put it, reverse engineer, back engineer, understand the technology of what were described to him as 9 alien spacecraft allegedly stored at Area 51. And Lazar said, you know, they weren't in kind of the typical Roswell scenario. They weren't like crashed UFOs all mangled and destroyed and, you know, just debris and pieces strewn all over the place. He actually said that these were just, they looked like in full working order and they were stored in hangars. And the story that he told is that he got to see these craft and was given dozens and dozens of documents that extended to literally hundreds of pages, sort of like classified briefings on the alleged knowledge of the US government on an alien presence on the Earth. And Lazar said he worked on this program for a number of months and to try and understand the propulsion system of the craft, which was described as a super heavy element, which actually doesn't exist, or at least it's existed in temporary form in experiments called element 115. But as far as we're aware, at least, it doesn't exist literally on our planet. And he said that the program, unlike a lot of people have said, you know, the government knows all what's going on, have all the answers. He said the government didn't really know much at all. He said they got these craft, but really were struggling to understand the technology, and they were just kind of scratching their heads and just looking at them in these hangars, trying to get people on board who might be able to give some sort of insight and perspective on how these craft might work and how we might be able to replicate and weaponize the technology. Now, Lazar did something which he said basically got him kicked out of the program. He told a number of his friends and his wife what was going on there, which he was told, you know, don't tell anybody, this is sort of classified, etc. And he was told that that was what got him fired. Now, he claimed, and again it's a claim, he said after he got fired he started to get threats and intimidations. He said one of his tyres was shot out on the back of his car. You know, whether it's true or not, we just don't know, but he said that's what prompted him to go public. Now, a lot of UFO researchers, for example, like Stanton Friedman, they completely dismiss Lazar's story totally. They say, Stan actually said, to quote him, he said, "This is bunk, bunk, bunk." That was his exact words. Now, other people are not quite so sure that Lazar is just the hoaxer that many, or a number, have assumed him to be. For example, one of the big questions about Lazar is his background. Now, Lazar claimed that he worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory on physics-related programs, and Los Alamos, when they were approached in 1989 and basically were asked to respond to these claims that one of their former employees was working to back engineer crashed UFOs or recovered UFOs at Area 51, they said, no, this is nonsense. There's nobody named Bob Lazar, Robert Lazar, or Robert Scott Lazar, to give him his full name, has ever worked here, period. And George Knapp, an enterprising Nevada journalist, actually began to delve deeper, not just into Lazar's story, but his background. And he actually got hold of a copy of the Los Alamos Labs phone directory for 1982, and Lazar is in there. His name's in there. It even tells you which office he was in at the base. So when the media then approached Los Alamos again, they said, well, okay, yes, we made a mistake, he did work here, but he was actually working here under a contract agency whose staff we hired rather than working direct for Los Alamos, which again isn't impossible. Now, on top of that, people say, well, how did you get the job? You know, what was the process by which you got, you know, offered this position? And he said that in 1982, when he was working at Los Alamos, he attended a lecture by a famous, very famous American scientist named Dr. Edward Teller. And Dr. Edward Teller was what's really somebody at the forefront of sort of US science and technology from the 40s onwards. And Teller was also one of the inspirations, if you've ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, he was sort of one of the inspirations for the sort of the mad scientist in the film. But Teller was a very brilliant character. And Lazar said that he went up to Teller because Teller was one of his inspirations and heroes. And it so happened that on the day that Teller was giving his lecture, there was an article in the Los Alamos Monitor newspaper, Las Vegas Monitor, all about Lazar's work, because he used to build jet cars. That was his thing. He used to enjoy going out in the desert with these souped-up cars, you know, that could do 150 mile an hour or whatever in the desert. And Teller said, well, you know, this is interesting, you know, and what are you doing? He said, well, I'm a physicist, you know, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And further down the line, Teller basically sort of alluded to the idea that, you know, he could fix him up in an even more interesting job, you know, that he would find interesting, which is probably, you know, the understatement of the century. You know, you're going to be offered a job working on crashed UFOs, and you might find it interesting, you know. So, but that was sort of the scenario laid out. And from Teller, there was like a process allegedly where Lazar was approached by different people. Then he would go for an interview, and he was told, you know, you could be working on an interesting propulsion system. So he said, well, yeah, you know, tell me more, and if you want to sign me up, you know, I'll come on board. Now, you would imagine that if Lazar had lied about this situation with Teller, in terms of saying, yeah, this is how I got the job, and this guy basically, you know, sort of set the wheels in motion in terms of getting me the job, you would think that Teller would have said not just no, but hell no, you know, I have no knowledge of crashed UFOs, I have no knowledge of what's going on in Area 51, and I certainly didn't refer this guy for the job. That actually isn't what happened. Teller was approached again by Las Vegas media, and if you ever watch the interview, he squirms to about the most extreme degree you could imagine to avoid answering any questions. What he actually says is, I don't know Bob Lazar, I don't remember Bob Lazar, but maybe I met him, and if I met him and I liked him, maybe I referred him to for a job, but don't quote me on that because I can't remember. Now that, you know, that to me sounds a strange response to make, you know. And Teller clearly knew the subject matter, that it was dealing with UFOs, because Lazar by this time was sort of a, you know, a known commodity, not just in the UFO field, but also in the Nevada media, and he was certainly growing in the national media as well. So it's things like this, and George Knapp also tracked down some of Lazar's colleagues when he was working at Los Alamos, who told him that Lazar worked also on President Reagan's so-called Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative program. So it's things like this that keep Lazar's story open in the minds of many. As I said, other people dismiss him as somebody who's sort of maybe an unknowing patsy, if you like, to try and get people to believe there are crashed UFOs at Area 51, to hide classified military programs. I mean, you know, if we look today at things like these stealth drones that are being flown and things like this, you know, you go back 20 years, 30 years, when some of these early drone technologies were being developed in rudimentary stages. If you were to see one of these things, you would think it was a UFO. Some people believe maybe Lazar really was exposed to genuine technology, but it was kind of a ruse to sort of spread this seed that it was alien. And the people who sort of stick to this theory, they believe the idea was for Lazar to go out and actively promote this particular story, and then what would happen, it would possibly reel in Soviet spies who might be in Nevada trying to determine what's going on, and arrest them with no actual real secrets having been disclosed. So that's why Area 51 has become such an enigmatic place, because it's sort of not as black and white as either crashed UFOs are held there or they're not. You have all these sort of different issues relative to potential like disinformation and counterintelligence programs to hide something else under a smokescreen of something else. You have this man whose background checks out to a degree, but to another degree doesn't. You have people who you would imagine would take legal action against him, like Edward Teller, squirming to avoid answering any questions about the Tsar. So, you know, that's sort of what we know versus what we don't know. And as I said, those are the important things to point out. You know, it's not a straightforward issue as to what's going on at Area 51 or isn't. Now, if we move from the hot desert of Nevada, that's blustery old England, where I'm originally from. That's, as you can see, that's taken in December, I think about 10 years ago, when it was something like -15 or something. And that's actually a base called Royal Air Force Bentwaters, which is now closed down. And Bentwaters was involved in a famous UFO incident in December 1980 that's become known as the Rendlesham Forest incident, which some of you might have heard of. Basically, the story is that, I should sort of backtrack. At the height of the Cold War, when the Soviets were still the big threat on the world stage, a number of British military bases were sort of leased out to the US. And so there was like a large American military presence, particularly on the east coast of England, because the east coast is obviously where the Soviets would have attacked. So, you know, not only would it be like a first response location, but the radars would all be sort of focused on Eastern Europe and Russia, etc., to guard for any surprise attacks and spy missions, that sort of thing. So there was this heavy US military presence down the east coast, and one of the bases was this one, Royal Air Force Bentwaters. And in December 1980, a number of the airmen stationed at the base said that they saw this small, kind of like a triangular-shaped UFO manoeuvring through the woods of the nearby forest, which is called Rendlesham Forest. A number of airmen have come forward talking about their involvement in this incident, which basically extends from some of the airmen seeing like a triangular-shaped craft, maybe about this high, sort of 8-9 feet tall, sort of triangular pyramid-shaped. A number of the other airmen talked about seeing small creatures which seemed more sort of like spectral, like holograms, where they could kind of, they could see through them almost. You could see the trees behind these creatures, whereas if they were sort of semi-physical or not. And we know that the British Ministry of Defence and the US Air Force and also the National Security Agency were all involved in the investigation, and everybody's conclusion is that the airmen simply mistook what they said was the UFO. The official response is that they were mistaken by the lights from a nearby lighthouse. Now, one of the things that's been pointed out is that either the guys reported what they saw accurately, or they reported it totally inaccurately. And the argument's been made that either way it's got to have a defence on the nation, because on the one hand, if a UFO sort of penetrated British airspace, came down or landed in a forest on the edge of a very strategic US military held British installation, that's got to have a defence aspect to it and a national security aspect. And equally, if trained men who were also in charge of you know, very advanced weaponry hallucinated or couldn't tell the difference between a 9-foot tall UFO and the lights of a lighthouse a couple of miles away, that should have a bearing on national security as well. But the government's official stance is, whatever happened, it had no bearing on the defence of the realm, national security, or anything at all. Their official response is, well, unexplained lights were seen, but no damage was done, so we're not going to investigate it, we're not going to do anything with it. And by the British Ministry of Defence's own admission, the story is that the US Air Force prepared a report, sent it to the British Ministry of Defence, who said, very interesting, nothing happened, because the report was sent in a week later, so clearly we weren't attacked, forget about it. Which, again, you know, you can rule UFOs out of the equation, but if you have 30, 40 military personnel who can't tell the difference between something on the ground and a lighthouse, there should have been an investigation into that. The very fact that even that wasn't investigated has led a lot of people to think that, you know, there has to have been some sort of cover-up. Now, the reason I include this in the book is because one of the airmen who went public about his involvement in this was a man named Larry Warren, and actually lives in England now. But he was stationed over there, and he liked England, decided to stay, and he came back and forth, and he lives in the north of England now. And he was one of the witnesses, not just to the landing of the UFO, but also to these little creatures that he said were sort of milling around the craft and floating around it, which he described as sort of 3 to 4 feet tall, with these cat-like faces and cat-like eyes, kind of not like the sort of typical greys that you see in, you know, UFO lore. So they're a bit different to that, and they were sort of encased in these large floating balls of light. But why this sort of crosses over into sort of off-limits areas? I mean, Bentwaters was never an off-limits base as such. You know, it was a